Hey there, friend. Welcome back. Or maybe this is your very first time here. Either way, I'm so glad you showed up tonight. Get comfortable, dim the lights a little, because what I'm about to tell you is not the Paris you think you know. Imagine this. The year is 1920. You're standing in the heart of Paris, France, and the city is absolutely electric. Champagne is flowing. Jazz is pouring out of every open window. Women in short dresses are laughing in the streets, and somewhere in Montparnasse a young American named Ernest Hemingway is sitting in a cafe drinking wine and telling himself he's going to write the greatest novel the world has ever seen. It looks like paradise. It sounds like paradise. But here is the thing nobody tells you. Underneath all of that laughter, underneath all of that champagne and music and dancing, this city was sitting on top of 10 million graves. And tonight, we're going to find out what really happened when Paris decided to party instead of grieve. Before we dive in together, I just want to say, if this kind of storytelling is something you enjoy, the kindest thing you can do is hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It truly means the world to me, and it helps more people find their way here on a quiet night like this one. And hey, I am genuinely curious. Where are you watching this right now? A cozy bedroom, a late night drive? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Now soft lights on, maybe a gentle fan in the background, and let us begin. So let us go back. All the way back to the morning of November the 11th, 1918. The guns went quiet. After 4 years and 3 months of the most horrifying war the world had ever witnessed, World War I was officially over. And the numbers, if you let them sink in for just a moment, are almost impossible to wrap your head around. Approximately 10 million soldiers dead. 7 million civilians gone. France alone had lost around 1,400,000 of her young men, a number that represented nearly the entire generation of men between the ages of 18 and 30. Think about that for a second. In some small villages across France, 100% of the men of fighting age simply did not come home. The country was scarred. Physically, yes. Entire landscapes across northern France had been reduced to nothing but mud and shell craters. But psychologically, that was the wound nobody could see, and nobody really knew how to treat. So what do you do when you are a nation carrying that much grief? Apparently, you throw the biggest party in the history of the modern world. By 1920, something extraordinary and honestly a little haunting started happening in Paris. The cabarets reopened. The jazz clubs multiplied almost overnight. The fashion houses began unveiling shorter hemlines, bolder colours, wilder silhouettes. A new spirit was spreading through the city like wildfire. The French called it les années folles. Translated into English, that means the crazy years, and crazy they absolutely were. But here is the question that kept me up at night when I first started researching this story. Was this celebration genuine joy? Or was it something darker? A kind of collective decision, almost unconscious, to run as fast as possible from a pain too enormous to face. Historians have debated this for decades. The French psychoanalyst and writer Paul Virilio once described post-war societies as existing in what he called a state of dramology. Essentially, a culture that moves faster and faster, not because it is going somewhere, but because it is terrified of stopping. When you stop, you remember. When the music pauses, you hear the silence where your brother used to laugh. And Paris in the 1920s simply refused to let the music pause. Now here is a detail that I find genuinely fascinating and a little bit heartbreaking. The very neighbourhoods that became the beating heart of Parisian nightlife in the 1920s were just a few years earlier overflow zones for military hospitals. Montparnasse, the Bohemian Quarter where artists and writers gathered in cafes until 3 in the morning, had housed rows of wooden barracks filled with wounded soldiers as recently as 1917. The famous Café Le Dôme, which would later become the unofficial living room of the lost generation of American writers, sat just a few blocks from where operating tents had once been set up to handle the endless stream of casualties from the Western Front. The city quite literally built its party on top of its trauma, and the government in its own way encouraged this. France's political leaders understood something very practical. A grieving, shattered population is an unstable one. Bread and circuses, as the ancient Romans used to say. Give the people something to celebrate, something to feel proud of, something to look forward to, and they're less likely to start asking difficult questions. Questions like, why did we lose so many men for so little ground? Questions like, who exactly benefited from this war? So the government invested in tourism, in culture, in the image of Paris as the glamorous centre of the civilized world, and it worked brilliantly. By 1925, Paris was drawing visitors from all over the world, and in particular a very special and very enthusiastic group of arrivals from across the Atlantic Ocean, the Americans. Now I want you to picture this. It is the summer of 1921. A young man from Oak Park, Illinois, steps off a boat in France. He's 21 years old, fresh out of covering the war as a journalist, restless and hungry, and convinced that he has something important to say. His name is Ernest Miller Hemingway, and the moment he arrived in Paris, he understood immediately that something magical and slightly insane was happening here. He wrote to a friend back home, and I am going to paraphrase because the original letter is a little colourful, that Paris felt like nowhere else on earth, like a city that had decided collectively and stubbornly that the only reasonable response to death was to live louder. He was not wrong. But what Hemingway and his fellow American expatriates could not quite see, at least not at first, was that the party they were so enchanted by was not really being thrown for them. It was being thrown to drown something out, a sound just below the music, a sound that every French man and woman who had lived through the war could hear even when the jazz was at its loudest. It was the sound of a wound that had never been allowed to close, and that is where our story truly begins. Because over the next 11 chapters of this journey tonight, we're going to peel back the glittering surface of the 1920s in Paris, layer by layer. We're going to meet the men who came back from the trenches and could never quite explain what they had seen. We're going to walk the streets of Pigalle at midnight and discover a side of the City of Light that most history books quietly skip over. We're going to sit across the table from Josephine Baker and ask a question that makes everyone uncomfortable. And we're going to stand in October of 1929 and watch the music stop. But first, before any of that, we need to understand the men who came home. Because the party of the 1920s did not happen despite the soldiers who returned from World War I broken and haunted. It happened because of them. The veterans of the Western Front were the ones who threw open the doors and said no more waiting, no more being careful, no more saving things for later. Later is not promised. We learned that in the mud of Verdun. So let us talk about them. The broken men who came home and what they did with the darkness they carried back with them from the front. There is a question I want you to sit with for just a moment before we go any further. Have you ever watched someone laugh a little too hard at a joke that was not that funny, or noticed a friend who keeps themselves impossibly busy, filling every single hour of every single day with noise and activity and plans, and you get this quiet feeling that if the noise ever stopped, something very fragile inside them might break? That is what the 1920s in Paris looked like up close, and the men at the centre of it all were the ones nobody really wanted to look at directly. When the soldiers came home in late 1918 and into 1919, France threw them parades. There were speeches, there were medals, there were tearful reunions on train platforms that could have come straight out of a film, and then very quickly the world moved on and expected the soldiers to move on with it. But something had happened to these men in the trenches that no one had a proper name for yet. The British Army doctor Charles Myers had actually coined the term shell shock as early as 1915, trying to describe the trembling, the nightmares, the inability to speak, the blank staring the men who jumped at the sound of a door closing because their nervous systems had permanently rewired themselves to expect explosions. By 1918, the British military had treated over 80,000 cases officially classified as shell shock, and that was only the cases that made it into an official file. The real number historians now estimate was several times higher. France had its own version of the same crisis, what French military psychiatrists quietly called traumatic neurosis. By 1920, the French government was paying disability pensions to over 40,000 veterans for what the paperwork called nervous disorders. Within 2 years, that number had climbed past 65,000. 65,000 men in one country, officially recognized as psychologically shattered. And those were just the ones who had been examined and documented. Now here is where it gets personal and a little devastating. I want to tell you about a man named Louis-Ferdinand Céline. He was 20 years old when he enlisted in the French cavalry in 1912. By the time World War I ended, he had been wounded in battle, suffered what his doctors described as persistent neurological damage, and received the Médaille Militaire, one of France's highest military honours. He came home. He studied medicine. He became a doctor working with the poor in the suburbs north of Paris. And then in 1932 he published a novel called Voyage au bout de la nuit, Journey to the End of the Night. It is one of the most brutal, most honest, most uncomfortable books ever written in the French language. And it is essentially a direct transmission of what it felt like to be a young man who had looked into the absolute worst of what human beings are capable of and then been handed a baguette and told to get on with things. The novel caused a literary scandal. Some critics called it disgusting. Some called it a masterpiece. It sold out almost immediately. Because the veterans who read it recognized themselves on every single page. Céline was not writing fiction. He was writing a confession on behalf of an entire generation that had been given no language, no framework, no permission to say this broke us. We came back, but we left something in those fields that we are never going to get back. So what did they do with that well? Some of them drank. Paris in the 1920s had a complicated relationship with alcohol that is genuinely hard to overstate. The city's cafés and wine bars were not just social spaces. For a significant portion of the veteran population, they were the closest thing to a coping mechanism that society was willing to provide. The anciens combattants, the veterans' associations, grew to enormous size in post-war France. By 1927, more than 3 million French veterans were registered members of some form of veterans' organisation. 3 million people all quietly carrying the same weight, gathering together and doing what people have always done when the weight gets too heavy. They talked, they drank, they sat in the particular silence that only people who have shared something unspeakable can share together. And the city of Paris, with its hundreds of cafes and its culture of long evenings over bottles of wine, accommodated this perfectly. But I want to be honest with you here because this is the part of the story that tends to get flattened into something too simple. It would be easy to say the veterans were sad they drank the end. The reality was far more layered than that. Many of the men who had served were also extraordinarily alive in a way that civilians found both magnetic and unsettling. They had a quality that is difficult to describe. a kind of radical presence, a refusal to take anything for granted because they had spent years living inside the understanding that tomorrow was genuinely not guaranteed. One French veteran and writer, Henri Barbusse, whose war novel Under Fire won the Prix Goncourt in 1916 and sold over 200,000 copies, described his fellow soldiers as men who had been stripped of everything except the moment. And when those men came home to peacetime Paris, they brought that quality with them. They were the ones who danced until 4 a.m, not because they were carefree, but because they understood in their bones how briefly the music plays. They were the ones who spent their last few francs on a good bottle of Burgundy, not because they were reckless, but because they had learned in the most unforgiving classroom imaginable that pleasure deferred is often pleasure lost entirely. Does that make the party of the 1920s more beautiful knowing that? Or does it make it sadder? I genuinely am not sure. Maybe both. Maybe that is the most honest answer. There is one more piece of this that I cannot skip past, and it is the one that history tends to whisper rather than say out loud. The disfigured veterans. In France they were called the gueules cassées, literally the broken faces. Men who had survived the war, but whose faces had been so severely damaged by shrapnel burns and gunfire that they required extensive reconstructive surgery, much of which was still in its earliest experimental stages. The pioneering work of surgeons like Harold Gillies in Britain and Hippolyte Morestin in France represented some of the first modern plastic surgery in human history, developed not in the service of vanity, but out of the urgent, heartbreaking need to help young men look in the mirror again. Many of the girls' cassés wore specially crafted masks, some made of painted tin, some of copper carefully shaped to resemble the faces they had lost. They walked the streets of Paris in these masks while just around the corner the champagne corks were flying and the jazz bands were playing. The city held both realities at once somehow, the masks and the dancing. And this, I think, is the key to understanding everything that comes next in our story tonight. Paris in the 1920s was not simply a city that had forgotten its pain. It was a city that had made a very deliberate, very human choice to hold its pain in one hand and its joy in the other, and to walk forward anyway. The tragedy is not that people danced. The tragedy is what they were dancing to avoid seeing. And in the shadows of those gleaming Parisian cafés, something else was already arriving in the city. Something that would deepen the story considerably and give the party an entirely different kind of fuel. Because mixed in with the veterans and the jazz musicians and the poets, a very specific type of newcomer had begun flooding into Paris from across the Atlantic Ocean. Young, ambitious, carrying American dollars that stretched magnificently against the weakened French franc, and running, every single one of them, from something back home. Who were they? What were they escaping, and what did their arrival do to a city that was already quietly coming apart at the seams? That is exactly where we are headed next. Picture the scene for a second. It is 1920. You're a young American. You're smart, restless, maybe a little too sensitive for your own good. You have big ideas and a typewriter, and exactly the kind of burning ambition that small Midwestern towns have a very particular talent for making you feel embarrassed about. And then someone tells you that for the price of a boat ticket, you can land in a city where $1 buys you 3 times what it buys you back home, where the wine is cheaper than coffee, where nobody cares who your father is or what church you attend on Sundays, where the entire culture is built around the idea that art and pleasure and long conversations about ideas are not luxuries, they are the whole point of being alive. You would go, of course you would go, and they went by the thousands. Between 1920 and 1929, an estimated 30,000 Americans were living in Paris at any given time. Some estimates push that number even higher during the peak years of the mid-20s. They came from New York, from Chicago, from small towns in Ohio and Texas that most Europeans had never heard of and could not have found on a map. They came for different reasons, but underneath all those different reasons there was usually one reason. They were running from prohibition. On January the 16th, 1920, just 14 months after the guns of World War I went quiet, the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution came into effect. The manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol was now illegal across the entire country. Now I want to be fair here. The people who pushed for prohibition had genuine concerns about the social damage that excessive drinking was causing in American communities. That part of the history is real and it deserves acknowledgement, but the effect on a generation of creative young Americans who'd already watched the world nearly destroy itself, who were already questioning every institution and every authority figure they had ever been handed, the effect was roughly equivalent to telling a pressure cooker to just calm down. They left. Paris, meanwhile, had a very specific economic situation that made it extraordinarily welcoming to people carrying American dollars. The French franc had been devastated by the cost of World War I. France had borrowed enormously from the United States from Britain, from anyone willing to lend to finance 4 years of catastrophically expensive industrial warfare. By 1920, the franc had lost roughly 70% of its pre-war value against the dollar. What this meant in practical terms was almost comically favourable for American visitors. Hemingway wrote about this with the kind of barely concealed glee that only a 22-year-old who has just discovered he can eat well for almost nothing can manage. In his memoir, A Movable Feast, published after his death in 1964, but describing his Paris years of the early 1920s, he described eating oysters at a restaurant on the Place Saint-Michel and drinking white wine and paying what amounted to a few cents in American money. A good meal at a proper Paris restaurant, the kind of place with white tablecloths and a serious wine list, cost an American expatriate roughly the equivalent of 30 or 40 cents in 1922. A studio apartment in Montparnasse, the neighbourhood that became the unofficial capital of American Bohemian Paris, could be rented for a few dollars a month. For a young writer or painter who'd been scraping by in New York, this was not just affordable, it was transformative. For the first time in their lives, they could actually afford to do nothing but write, or paint, or argue about writing and painting, which for certain personality types is basically the same thing. But here is where I want to slow down, because this is the part of the story that tends to get told with a kind of warm golden glow, and I think it deserves a slightly more honest light. The Americans who poured into Paris in the 1920s were not just free spirits seeking artistic liberation. They were also, whether they fully realized it or not, beneficiaries of an economic collapse that was genuinely painful for the French people living around them. While Hemingway was celebrating cheap oysters, the Parisian working class, the bakers, the laundry women, the factory workers, the seamstresses were watching their savings evaporate in real time. A French worker earning wages in francs was seeing the purchasing power of those wages shrink year after year. Things that had been affordable before the war were becoming luxuries. Things that had been luxuries were becoming completely out of reach. The gleaming café culture that the Americans fell so deeply in love with, the long evenings over bottles of Bordeaux, the croissants and café au lait in the morning sunlight, was being sustained in part by a severe and growing inequality between those who earned in dollars and those who earned in francs. It is one of history's quieter ironies that the most celebrated artistic community of the 20th century was built in part on the economic misfortune of the very city that hosted it, And now I want to introduce you to someone whose story cuts right to the heart of this. Her name was Gertrude Stein. She was born in Allegheny, Pennsylvania in 1874. She studied under the philosopher and psychologist William James at Harvard Annex, what later became Radcliffe College. She attempted medical school at Johns Hopkins and deliberately failed her final exams because she was bored. In 1903, she moved to Paris with her brother Leo and never meaningfully returned to the United States for the rest of her life. By the 1920s, her apartment at 27 Rue de Fleurus had become perhaps the most important literary salon in the Western world. Picasso had painted her portrait, a process that took over 80 sittings, and produced a canvas that now hangs in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Matisse was a regular visitor, and on any given Saturday evening you might find yourself sitting across from a young Hemingway or F. Scott Fitzgerald or Sherwood Anderson, all orbiting around Gertrude like planets around a very opinionated sun. It was Stein who gave this generation of American expatriates their most enduring label. "You are all a lost generation," she told Hemingway, reportedly repeating something her Parisian car mechanic had said to her about a young worker who lacked the proper discipline. Hemingway used it as an epigraph in The Sun Also Rises, published in 1926, and the phrase stuck to his entire generation like a name tag they never asked for. But what did lost actually mean? I've thought about this a lot, and I think the word is doing more work than people usually give it credit for. These were not people who were lost in the sense of being confused or directionless. Many of them were extraordinarily purposeful. Hemingway wrote with a discipline that bordered on obsessive. Fitzgerald, despite everything, produced work of genuine and lasting beauty. They were lost in a more specific and more devastating sense. They had been handed a world shaped by certain values: patriotism, duty, faith, progress, the idea that civilization was marching steadily forward towards something better, and then they had watched that world use those exact values to justify the deaths of 10 million people. They did not know what to believe anymore, and Paris, with its cafés and its wine and its glorious refusal to take anything too seriously, offered something that felt at least temporarily like an answer. Not a solution, not a healing, but a place to be beautifully, articulately, stylishly uncertain, which is its own kind of seduction, honestly. And it is worth asking, and I mean this as a genuine question, not a rhetorical one, whether that is so different from what many of us are looking for right now in our own strange and uncertain moment. A place where the uncertainty feels elegant rather than terrifying. The Americans brought their dollars and their hunger and their disillusionment, and Paris absorbed all of it. But they were not the only outsiders flooding into the city during this decade. From another direction entirely, something new and electric was arriving in Paris, a sound that the city had never heard before, carried by musicians and performers who brought with them not just their art, but an entire world of experience that Paris was wholly unprepared to understand. And the way Paris responded to that arrival, the way the city loved it and misunderstood it, and profited from it all at the same time, is one of the most complicated and revealing chapters of this entire story. It starts with a woman in a skirt made of artificial bananas, and it goes somewhere much darker and much more important than the applause ever suggested. Let me set something straight before we go any further. When most people think about the 1920s in Paris, the word drugs does not usually appear in the first 10 images that come to mind. They think of Chanel, they think of Picasso, they think of that iconic black and white photograph of Hemingway looking effortlessly handsome outside a cafe. But here is what those photographs do not show you. What was on the table next to the wine glass? What was tucked inside the jacket pocket? What the pharmacist on the corner of Boulevard du Montparnasse was quietly selling over the counter, wrapped in plain paper, no prescription required. Cocaine in the 1920s was not a secret. It was not an underground thing whispered about in dark alleys. For a significant portion of the decade, it was simply available, normalized in a way that is genuinely difficult to imagine today. Its path into Parisian society had actually begun decades earlier. In the 1880s and 90s, cocaine was celebrated as a medical wonder. Sigmund Freud wrote enthusiastically about its benefits in an 1884 paper called Über Coca, his examination of the substance's potential for treating depression and fatigue. Vin Mariani, a French wine infused with coca leaf extract, was so popular that it received an endorsement from Pope Leo XIII, who apparently carried a small flask of it for personal use. The original formula of Coca-Cola invented in 1886 contained actual cocaine until it was quietly removed in 1903. By the time the 1920s arrived, cocaine had been partially regulated. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act in the United States in 1914 had begun restricting it, and France had passed its own narcotics legislation in 1916. But legislation and reality, as any historian will tell you, are two entirely different things. On the streets of Paris in the early 20s, this substance remained shockingly accessible, and in certain circles, artistic circles, theatrical circles, the circles where American expatriates and French bohemians overlapped, it was practically a social currency. I want to give you a sense of just how embedded this was in the cultural fabric of the city. The Moulin Rouge and the Casino de Paris, the two great entertainment palaces of the era, were not just places where you watched performers. They were ecosystems, and inside those ecosystems the performers themselves were often using stimulants simply to survive the punishing schedule of shows, sometimes 2 or 3 full performances a night, 6 nights a week in venues packed with hundreds of people generating enormous heat. The dancer and choreographer Loie Fuller, an American who had become a sensation in Paris since the 1890s and was still enormously influential in the early 20s, reportedly managed her chronic pain and performance anxiety with a combination of substances that her physician supplied without much apparent concern. But it was not only the performers. The audience in many cases came prepared as well. A 1924 report by the French Prefecture of Police, the equivalent of the city's main law enforcement authority, noted with considerable alarm that cocaine use in Paris entertainment venues had become so visible that officers were struggling to address it without effectively emptying the establishments entirely. Think about that for a moment. The police were essentially saying, if we enforce this law properly, we will have to shut down half the nightlife of Paris. And nobody wanted that. Now, I want to be careful here because it would be very easy to tell this part of the story in a way that romanticizes it, and I refuse to do that. Because behind the glittering surface of the artistic myth, the idea of the tortured genius fueling their creativity with exotic substances, the reality was considerably less glamorous. The writer Jean Cocteau is one of the most instructive examples of this period, and also one of the most heartbreaking. Cocteau was by any measure extraordinary. He was a poet, a novelist, a playwright, a filmmaker, a visual artist, a man of almost supernatural creative energy, who seemed to exist at the intersection of every important cultural movement of his time. He was friends with Picasso, with Stravinsky, with Proust. He wrote the libretto for ballets, designed posters, made films that are still studied in cinema schools a century later. He was also, for much of the 1920s, severely dependent on opium. His addiction began around 1924, introduced to him partly through his close friendship with the young Raymond Radiguet, a prodigiously talented writer who died of typhoid fever at the age of 20 in December of that year. Cocteau was devastated, and in his grief, opium became what he later described in a memoir called Opium, the Diary of His Cure, published in 1930 as the only substance that gives me the sensation of extraordinary health. He attempted to stop multiple times. He was admitted to a clinic in Saint-Cloud in 1925. He relapsed. He was admitted again. He relapsed again. What makes his account so valuable to us now, and what makes it such an important corrective to the glamorous mythology of this era, is the specificity of his descriptions. He did not write about opium as a key that unlocked some divine creative chamber. He wrote about it as a cage, a beautiful, warm, deceptively comfortable cage that gradually replaced everything else in his life. His relationships, his ambitions, his ability to simply sit in a room without needing it. Everything one does in life, he wrote, even love occurs in an express train racing toward death. That is not a man celebrating. That is a man trying to explain with the limited vocabulary available to him what it felt like to be at the mercy of something he could not control. And Cocteau was not alone, not by a long distance. The poet and novelist Francis Carco, who documented the Montmartre underworld with a journalist's eye and a poet's ear, wrote extensively about the culture of what the French called la drogue, the drug spreading through the artistic communities of the Left Bank and Montmartre simultaneously. He described cafés where a particular code of behavior existed, certain tables, certain gestures, certain regulars who never quite met your eyes. The jazz musician Django Reinhardt, though his greatest fame came slightly later in the early 1930s, came of age in the Romany communities of Paris during this exact period, and the stories he and his contemporaries told about their early years in the city painted a vivid picture of a nocturnal world where the boundaries between music poverty and substance use were almost entirely porous. Meanwhile, at the more fashionable end of the social spectrum, cocaine had become associated with a particular kind of chic that the fashion world was actively cultivating. Coco Chanel, and I say this as someone who deeply admires what she built, was reportedly a cocaine user during portions of the 1920s, a fact that her biographers have documented with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Her lover at the time, the Duke of Westminster, moved in circles where the substance was treated with roughly the same casualness as a glass of champagne before dinner. The couture houses, the grand hotels, the private clubs of the 16th arrondissement, these were not immune. In some ways, they were the epicenter. Here is the question I find myself sitting with every time I go deep into this particular chapter of history. Why did so many extraordinarily talented, intellectually sophisticated people who understood consequence, who understood narrative, who literally made their living by perceiving the world more clearly than most, why did they not see what was happening to them? And I think the honest answer is they did see it. They just did not have anywhere to put the knowledge. Post-war Paris had no real infrastructure for what we would now call mental health support. The concept of addiction as a medical condition rather than a moral failing was in its earliest, most contested stages of development. The Swiss psychiatrist Eugen Bleuler had begun using the term addiction in its modern sense around 1906, but his ideas were far from mainstream medical practice, let alone common public understanding. What people had instead was the city itself, the cafés, the music, the company of other people who were also in various ways self-medicating the particular grief of being alive and lucid in a world that had just demonstrated its capacity for incomprehensible violence. The substances were just the most visible symptom of something much deeper. They were the city's way of keeping the music loud enough that nobody had to hear the silence underneath. And speaking of silence underneath music, there is a part of this story that runs parallel to everything we have just talked about, and it is one that the history books handle with particular delicacy. because while the artists and the expatriates and the fashionable classes were navigating their complicated relationship with various substances on the left bank, the right bank had its own parallel world. A world of organised crime, territorial violence, and a shadow economy that had been quietly operating beneath the glittering surface of Paris since well before the war, and had grown considerably stronger during it. The men who ran that world had names, they had territories, they had a code of sorts. And they went by a name that even now carries a particular electricity. They called themselves the Apaches. Who were they? Where did they come from? And what did their presence in 1920s Paris tell us about the city that the postcards never showed? That is exactly where we are headed. Some stories have a way of arriving wrapped in applause, and for a long time the applause is so loud that nobody stops to ask what is actually happening underneath it. This is one of those stories. Her name was Frida Josephine MacDonald. She was born on June 3rd, 1906 in St. Louis, Missouri, a city whose relationship with racial segregation was in the early 20th century among the most brutal and explicitly violent in the entire United States. By the age of 8, she was working as a domestic servant for a white family. By 13, she had survived a race riot that killed dozens of people and burned whole neighborhoods of the city to the ground. By 15, she was performing in traveling vaudeville shows, developing the extraordinary physical comedy and timing that would define her for the rest of her life. By 19, she was in Paris, and Paris, in a very short period of time, decided it was absolutely obsessed with her. The real question, the one that is worth sitting with tonight, is what exactly Paris thought it was obsessed with. When Josephine Baker made her debut in the Revue Negre at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées on October 2nd, 1925, the response was unlike anything the Parisian theatrical world had witnessed in a generation. The audience was scandalized. The audience was electrified. The audience was, depending on which review you read, either witnessing the birth of a new art form or the collapse of Western civilization, with several critics suggesting, apparently without irony, that both things might simultaneously be true. The show itself was a production conceived and organized by an American socialite named Caroline Dudley Reagan, who had gone to Harlem looking for performers and come back with a company of black American musicians and dancers. The original star of the revue was not even Baker. It was an established singer named Maud de Forest. Baker was a supporting player, but Baker had something that defies easy description, a quality of absolute physical fearlessness combined with a comedic intelligence that was so fast, so precise, so genuinely original that she seemed to exist on a slightly different frequency from everyone else on the stage. The Parisian press lost its collective mind. Now here is where I need to slow down and ask you to set aside just for a moment everything you've ever seen in a documentary about this era, all the golden-toned footage, all the triumphant narration about liberation and freedom, and Paris as the capital of human possibility. Because what was actually being written about Josephine Baker in the Parisian press of 1925 and 1926 is by any honest reading deeply uncomfortable. The critic Pierre de Renier, writing in the influential literary journal Le Crapouillot, described her performance with language that he clearly intended as the highest possible praise, calling her the Black Venus, and describing her movements as having an animal beauty that European women could never achieve. Another widely read critic described her as a sublime bad taste, a phrase that tells you everything about the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Paris's reception of her. The celebrated Art Deco designer Paul Collin, who created the famous poster for the Revue Negre, depicted Baker and her fellow performers in illustrations that drew heavily on the visual vocabulary of racist caricature, Exaggerated features, jungle imagery, the whole register of visual language that European colonialism had spent 2 centuries developing to represent African and African-descended people as something fundamentally other. And Colin's poster was celebrated as a work of art. It was framed and sold and hung in fashionable apartments across the city. I want to be honest about something here, and I hope you will sit with it rather than rushing past it. There is a version of Josephine Baker's story that is told almost entirely as a triumph, and in many crucial respects it was. She became one of the most famous and highly paid performers in the world. She owned her own nightclub, Chez Josephine, which opened in 1926 on the Rue Fontaine in Montmartre. She became a French citizen. She worked for the French resistance during World War II with extraordinary courage, carrying intelligence documents hidden in her sheet music. She marched alongside Martin Luther King Jr. at the Washington March in 1963. She was one of the most remarkable human beings of the 20th century. All of that is true, and it is also true that the specific form of fame Paris offered her in those early years was built on a foundation of racial exoticism that had very little to do with seeing her clearly as a human being. The French intelligentsia of the 1920s had developed a cultural phenomenon they called negritude, but in its popular commercialized form, as opposed to the serious literary movement that would later reclaim the word. It functioned as a kind of fashionable primitivism. The idea, and I want to be careful to present this accurately rather than simply condemn it from a comfortable distance, was that black culture, African culture, jazz and movement and rhythm represented something that European civilization had lost in its long march toward modernity, something vital and embodied and free now. That idea on its surface sounds almost like a compliment, but think about what it is actually saying. It is saying we admire you not as an individual with a specific history, a specific craft, a specific set of choices and risks and hard-won skills, but as a representative of something we have decided you stand for, something primitive, something pre-rational, something we have romanticized precisely because we have defined it as the opposite of everything we consider fully human. That is not admiration. That is a more sophisticated form of the same dehumanization. And Josephine Baker knew it. She wrote about it, spoke about it, navigated it with a strategic intelligence that was itself a kind of masterpiece. Here is something that most of the breathless 1920s mythology leaves out entirely. Baker's famous banana skirt, the costume she wore in her Danse Sauvage number at the Folies Bergère, which opened in 1926 and became one of the most reproduced images of the entire decade, was not an expression of some authentic African identity. It was a costume designed by a white French set designer constructed to satisfy a specifically European fantasy about what African women looked and moved like. Baker wore it with full awareness of what it was. She performed in it with jaw-dropping technical brilliance. And she later spoke about that period of her career with a candor that deserves more attention than it typically receives. "I was cold," she said once of the early years, in a remark that has been recorded by several biographers. "I was always cold on that stage. The costumes were, well," she did not elaborate. She did not need to. There was a woman who knew Baker during this period whose account I find particularly illuminating. Her name was Ada Louise Smith, known universally as Bricktop, and she was an American-born singer and nightclub owner who had come to Paris in 1924 and built one of the most celebrated establishments of the era, Bricktop's on the Rue Pigalle, which became the unofficial gathering place of the Black American artistic community in Paris. Bricktop's memoir, published much later in her life, paints a picture of 2 parallel Parises operating simultaneously. There was the Paris that the white American expatriates experienced, the cafés of Montparnasse, the literary salons, the sense of almost endless freedom. And then there was the Paris that the black American community actually lived in, which had many of the same freedoms and was genuinely less segregated than the United States, but which also had its own specific forms of condescension and exploitation that were simply delivered with better manners and more elegant surroundings. Paris loved us. Bricktop wrote the way you love something exotic, the way you love a thing that you believe will always be safely on the other side of a stage. That sentence to me is one of the most precise and heartbreaking descriptions of the entire era. The jazz musician Sidney Bechet, a New Orleans-born soprano saxophonist who spent significant portions of the 1920s in Paris and is widely considered one of the most important improvisers in the early history of jazz, had an experience that illustrates the contradiction perfectly. In Paris, Bechet was celebrated. He was reviewed seriously. He was invited to perform in contexts that would have been utterly closed to him in the United States. Maurice Chevalier saw him perform and reportedly said that Bechet played like nobody else alive, and yet Bechet spent a year in a French prison in 1929 following an incident in Montmartre in which he was involved in a street altercation, a situation in which the French legal system, when it came down to the specific question of a black American man in a conflict with white European men, produced a result that looked, in its broad outlines, familiar to anyone who knew how these things tended to go. He was deported from France afterward. He eventually returned years later, spending the last decade of his life in Paris and dying there in 1959. But the year in prison, the deportation, these facts tend to get very quiet when people are writing the golden mythology of jazz in Paris. So what do we do with all of this? I think the honest answer is that we hold it in both hands at once, the way this story keeps asking us to do. Paris in the 1920s genuinely offered black American artists something that the United States in the same period brutally denied them: recognition, platform, a degree of social freedom that was real and meaningful and changed lives. And Paris simultaneously packaged and consumed and profited from those artists in ways that stripped them of their full humanity and replaced it with a romanticized, exoticized image that served European cultural needs rather than honoring the actual human beings involved. Both things are true. At the same time, in the same city, sometimes in the same room. And maybe that is the most important lesson of this whole chapter, that admiration and exploitation are not opposites. They can occupy the same breath. They can wear the same clothes. They can give you a standing ovation while simultaneously refusing to see you as fully real. Does any of that sound uncomfortably familiar? I'm going to let you sit with that question. Because we're about to turn our attention to something that operated on an entirely different scale, not in the theatres and nightclubs, but through an institution that was official, documented and embedded in the very administrative structure of the French state. 200 establishments, thousands of women, a system of regulation that the government called supervision, and that the women trapped inside it called something else entirely. The story of what Paris called its licensed houses, and what really went on behind those registered doors, is where we're headed next. Right then, let us talk about the part of Paris that the tourist postcards were very careful never to show you. Not the Eiffel Tower at sunset, not the flower markets along the Seine, not the elegant women in Chanel walking past the windows of Cartier on the Rue de la Paix. The other Paris, the one that existed in the gaslit alleys of Belleville at 2 a.m, the one that operated out of the back rooms of certain cafés in Montmartre, where the wrong kind of eye contact could rearrange your evening very dramatically. The one that had its own hierarchy, its own economy, its own brutal and surprisingly codified set of rules. The Paris of the Apaches. The name itself is worth pausing on because it tells you something immediately about how the city's respectable classes viewed the people it was attached to. Around 1902, a French journalist named Victor Maurice, writing for the newspaper Le Matin, used the word Apache to describe the violent criminal gangs that had been terrorizing the poorer neighborhoods of Paris for years. He borrowed the name from the Apache people of the American Southwest, whose fierce resistance to United States military campaigns had made them in the European imagination of that era a symbol of untamable, savage defiance. It was an extraordinarily loaded choice of words, and deeply unfair to the actual Apache people who deserve considerably better than to have their name borrowed as slang for Parisian street criminals. But the label stuck instantly. The press ran with it. And the young men it were applied to, here is the fascinating part, embraced it completely. They adopted the name, they performed it, they developed their own recognizable style, flat caps, pulled low, colourful scarves knotted at the throat trousers, cut in a distinctive way, a particular swagger that was part threat and part theatre. By the time the 1920s arrived, the Apache subculture had been a feature of Parisian street life for nearly 2 decades, and in the turbulent, chaotic years following World War I, it had grown considerably more organised. Let me give you a sense of the geography because it matters. Paris in the 1920s was not a unified city in any social sense. It was a collection of villages, essentially. Distinct neighbourhoods, with distinct populations, distinct loyalties, distinct economies. The Apache gangs operated primarily in 3 overlapping zones. Belleville in the northeast of the city was a working-class neighbourhood of extraordinary density. Hundreds of thousands of people crammed into narrow streets living in conditions that reformers of the era described with consistent horror. It was a neighbourhood of immigrants, of labourers, of people who'd come to Paris from the provinces or from other countries in search of work, and found themselves at the very bottom of a very steep social ladder. Montmartre, the hilly district in the north, occupied an interesting middle ground. By the 1920s, it had already begun its transformation from genuine bohemian enclave to tourist attraction. But that transformation was incomplete, and large portions of it remained genuinely rough, genuinely poor and genuinely dangerous after dark. And then there was Pigalle. Pigalle sits at the foot of Montmartre, where the respectable Paris of the boulevards met the considerably less respectable Paris of the cabarets and the gambling dens and the establishments that operated behind unmarked doors and charged accordingly. It was in the language of the era a zone of tolerance, a place where certain activities were understood to occur, where the police maintained a complicated and often financially negotiated relationship with the people running those activities, and where a visitor who did not know the rules could find themselves in serious difficulty very quickly. The Apache gangs of this era were not, I want to be clear, a single organisation with a central command structure. They were more like a loose ecosystem of competing and occasionally cooperating criminal enterprises, each controlling a specific territory and a specific set of revenue streams. What those revenue streams looked like in the 1920s was significantly more sophisticated than the knife fights and street robberies that the newspaper coverage tended to emphasise. Protection rackets were the foundation. The cafés, the small shops, the market stalls of Belleville and Montmartre paid regular fees to the local gang in exchange for being left alone, and in theory for being protected from anyone else who might have ideas about their cash registers. The gambling economy was enormous. The 1920s in Paris saw a proliferation of illegal gambling establishments, everything from sophisticated card rooms in private apartments to rougher dice games in back alleys, and the gangs that controlled access to these spaces generated substantial income. And then there was the network of what the French called maisons de passe, essentially short-stay establishments that operated in the grey zone around Pigalle and the Boulevard de Clichy connected to the legal licensed establishments that we'll examine more closely in a later part of our story tonight. The point is that by the 1920s, the Apache economy was a real economy. It had employees and territories and profit margins. It had people at the top who wore decent suits and ate at reasonable restaurants and were in certain carefully calibrated social contexts almost respectable. One figure from this world who captures something essential about the era is a man named Paul Leaker. Leaker had been one of the central figures in the most famous Apache gang war of the pre-war period, the 1902 conflict over a woman known as Cascador or Golden Helmet, whose real name was Amélie Elie. That conflict, which involved two rival gang leaders fighting over both her affections and territorial control of parts of Belleville, had captivated Paris with its combination of genuine violence and almost operatic passion. It ended with arrests, trials, convictions, and a degree of press coverage that turned Lisa and his rival Manda into something disturbingly close to celebrities. By the early 1920s, Leaker was out of prison and back in business. Older, more careful, operating with the kind of institutional knowledge that only comes from having made every possible mistake and survived the consequences. Men like Leaker represented a generation of Parisian criminals who had been shaped by the pre-war Apache tradition and had adapted to the new reality of the post-war city. A city flooded with money, with tourists, with the particular kind of chaos that follows a catastrophic war, and with a police force that was, to put it generously, operating with mixed incentives. The question of police corruption in 1920s, Paris is one that historians approach with significant care because the documentary record is complicated and the institutional sensitivity remains real even a century later. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this: the Prefecture of Police, which governed law enforcement in Paris, was operating under enormous pressure during this period. The city's population had grown dramatically. The influx of tourists and expatriates had created new policing challenges. The political climate, with the French government lurching between left and right coalitions with exhausting frequency throughout the decade, meant that the police force was regularly being reorganized, redirected, and sometimes quietly purged. In that environment, informal arrangements between certain officers and certain criminal operators were not exactly the exception. A 1925 parliamentary inquiry, triggered in part by a series of scandals involving police officers and the entertainment district around Pigalle, produced testimony suggesting that the payment of unofficial fees to local officers for the tolerance of certain operations was in at least some precincts essentially standard practice. The inquiry produced recommendations. The recommendations produced a period of visible enforcement activity. The enforcement activity eventually subsided, and the arrangements resumed. This is, if we are honest, not unique to Paris, not unique to the 1920s, not unique to France. Every major city in every era has navigated some version of this tension between the formal law and the informal economy that grows in its shadows. What makes the Paris version particularly interesting is the aesthetic dimension, because unlike, say, the Prohibition-era Chicago model of organized crime, which was loud and bloody and constantly front-page news, the Parisian criminal world of the 1920s operated with a quality that I can only describe as discretion. It was part of the fabric. It was understood to be there. It was in a strange way woven into the same mythology as the cafés and the jazz and the artists and the fashion, all part of the complex layered contradictory thing that Paris presented to the world as its identity. And here is what strikes me most thinking about all of this from a distance of 100 years. The Apache gangs and the artistic bohemians and the American expatriates and the traumatized veterans were all in their different ways doing the same thing. They were all living in the margins of a society that had been fundamentally broken by the war and had not yet, could not yet, build something new and whole to replace what had been lost. The veterans drank to silence the memories. The artists created to make meaning out of the meaninglessness. The expatriates fled to a place where the rules were different, and the men of the criminal underworld built their own parallel society with its own rules, its own economy, its own code of loyalty and consequence. None of them were the villain of this story. All of them were symptoms. But if the Apache underworld was one face of Paris's shadow economy, there was another face that was far more visible, far more systematized, and far more deeply embedded in the official life of the city than most people realize even today. It operated behind doors that were registered with the government. It paid taxes, of a kind. It was regulated, inspected, and in certain quarters almost celebrated, and it involved the exploitation of thousands of women in a way that the city's glamorous reputation has spent a century carefully papering over. We need to talk about it honestly, and we are going to do that right now. Let me tell you about a number, not a dramatic number, not the kind that appears in history books in bold type with an exclamation point attached. Just a quiet, administrative, almost boring number that nevertheless tells you more about the reality of life in 1920s Paris than almost anything else I could hand you. In 1921, United States dollar bought you approximately 8 French francs. By 1926, that same dollar bought you approximately 50 French francs. 6 years, the same coin, 6 times the purchasing power. Now, if you were one of the American expatriates we talked about earlier, sitting in your Montparnasse studio working on your novel planning a weekend trip to the Loire Valley, this number looked like a miracle. Like some benevolent force in the universe had decided that art and adventure should be available to anyone young and hungry enough to cross an ocean. But if you were a French baker, a seamstress, a postal worker, a school teacher in the 19th arrondissement earning a salary denominated in those same francs that were losing their value almost by the month, that number looked like something else entirely. It looked like the floor slowly dropping away beneath your feet. The story of the French franc in the 1920s is one of the most instructive economic narratives of the entire 20th century, and it is also one of the most underappreciated, mostly because it tends to get overshadowed by the more cinematic story of the American stock market crash of 1929, which we will reach in due course. But the French monetary crisis was not a sudden event. It was a slow, grinding, decade-long erosion that shaped the texture of everyday life in Paris in ways that the glamorous mythology of the era almost entirely erases. Here is how it happened. France had entered World War I with considerable gold reserves and a currency that was by the standards of the era genuinely strong. By the time the war ended in 1918, France had spent approximately 200 billion francs, a figure so astronomical that the French government had essentially printed its way through much of it, inflating the money supply dramatically and borrowing the rest from foreign creditors, most significantly the United States and Great Britain. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June of 1919, had promised France significant reparations payments from Germany. The political case for these reparations was both entirely understandable, and as events would prove catastrophically optimistic. France had suffered more physical destruction on its soil than any other major belligerent. Its northern industrial regions, the coalfields of the Nord-Pas-de-Calais, the steel mills of Lorraine, the agricultural land of the Somme and the Aisne, had been systematically dismantled, shelled flooded, and in some cases literally poisoned by years of industrial warfare. Someone had to pay for the reconstruction. The French government and the French public were entirely clear about who that someone should be. But Germany itself, economically devastated and politically convulsed, was fundamentally unable to pay at the scale and pace the treaty demanded. The reparations crisis of the early 1920s, culminating in France's occupation of the German industrial Ruhr region in January of 1923, a move that backfired economically almost immediately, left France in a worse position than it had been before. The franc spiraled. In 1921, a kilogram of bread in Paris cost approximately 65 centimes. By 1925, the same kilogram cost 1 franc and 40 centimes. By 1926, it had reached 2 francs in many neighbourhoods. The average daily wage of an unskilled Parisian worker in 1926 was approximately 25 to 30 francs. A skilled worker, a printer, a metal worker, a carpenter, might earn 40 to 50 francs per day on a good day. Now subtract rent, subtract fuel, subtract clothing for a family, subtract the school supplies for children. What you have left after all of that was not enough for the kind of Paris that Hemingway was describing in his letters home. Meanwhile, a young American journalist or writer arriving in Paris in 1925 with $200 in their pocket, which was a very modest amount of money by American standards, was arriving with the equivalent of 10,000 francs. 10,000 francs in a city where a worker earned 30 francs a day. That is more than 11 months of a working-class Parisian's wages in a single pocket, arriving off a boat. The economist and historian Kenneth More, in his detailed study of French monetary policy in this period, published in 1991, described the French franc crisis of the mid-1920s as producing a form of what he called monetary anxiety that permeated French society at every level. Not just among the poor, but among the middle classes, the pharmacists and notaries and small shopkeepers and civil servants who had built their sense of security around the stability of the franc, and now watched that stability dissolving in real time. This anxiety had a specific political character. The French middle class in the 1920s was deeply conservative in the most literal sense of that word. Not ideologically necessarily, but temperamentally. They wanted things to stay the same. They had organized their lives around the assumption of stability. They owned small amounts of property, modest savings, the kind of carefully assembled material security that takes a generation to build. Inflation destroyed that security with a thoroughness that no amount of thrift or prudence could prevent. It did not matter how carefully you had saved. It did not matter how responsibly you had managed your household. The franc was losing value faster than you could accumulate it, and there was nothing at all, that an individual person could do to protect themselves against it. That experience, the experience of doing everything right and watching it count for nothing, because forces entirely beyond your control had decided that the rules no longer applied, that experience produces a very specific kind of political emotion. And that emotion, when it finds an outlet, tends to find it in places that promise certainty, that promise strength, that promise someone to blame. Let me introduce you to a man whose trajectory through this decade tells the story of that political emotion with considerable precision. His name was Charles Maurras. Maurras was born in 1868 in the south of France, the son of a tax collector. He had been deaf since early childhood, a condition that he later described with characteristically perverse pride as having liberated him from the distractions of ordinary social life and forced him into the world of ideas. He was one of the most brilliant and one of the most dangerous intellectuals France produced in the 20th century, which is, when you think about France's output in this department, a genuinely competitive category. By the 1920s, Maurras was the intellectual heart of Action Française, the royalist nationalist violently anti-republican movement that had been agitating in French political life since the Dreyfus affair at the turn of the century. He edited its daily newspaper, he wrote its theory, he shaped its aesthetics, because Action Française was not just a political movement, but a cultural one with a carefully developed sensibility about literature and architecture, and the proper relationship between French civilization and the various forces it considered to be corrupting it. The movement's newspaper, also called Action Française, reached a circulation of approximately 100,000 readers per day. By the mid-1920s, that is not a marginal publication. That is a significant media presence in a country whose total newspaper market was not enormous. And Action Française was only the beginning, because during the 1920s a whole ecosystem of far-right political organizations was developing in France, many of them drawing explicitly on the energy of disillusionment, economic disillusionment, cultural disillusionment, the profound bitterness of men who felt that France had won the war in blood and lost the peace in paperwork. The Jeunesse Patriotes, the patriotic youth, was founded in 1924 by the deputy Pierre Taitinger, a man whose other claim to historical fame is that his family name is still on one of the most celebrated champagne houses in France. The Jeunesse Patriotes grew to somewhere between 90,000 and 120,000 members by the late 1920s. They wore blue berets, they organized rallies, they broke up left-wing meetings. The FAISO, founded in 1925 by Georges Valois, a former Action Française member who had become explicitly inspired by Benito Mussolini's seizure of power in Italy in 1922, was France's first openly fascist political party. Valois used the word himself without apology. He wanted a French Mussolini. He wanted a march on Paris. He wanted the Third Republic swept away. The FAISO did not, as it turned out, produce a French Mussolini. It peaked around 60,000 members and then collapsed under the weight of internal disputes and the temporarily stabilizing effect of the economic reforms we're about to discuss. But the fact that 60,000 people in Paris and its surroundings had at some point in the 1920s thought a French version of fascism was a reasonable response to their situation, that fact deserves considerably more attention than it typically receives in the golden mythology of this decade. The stabilization of the franc in 1926, when the conservative statesman Raymond Poincaré returned to power and implemented a brutal but effective package of tax increases and spending cuts that finally arrested the currency's slide, is often presented as the happy resolution of the economic subplot of the 1920s. And this is true. The Poincaré stabilization was a genuine achievement, and it did produce several years of relative prosperity in the late 1920s. But here is what the stabilization also did. It validated in the minds of many French conservatives the idea that strong, decisive, authoritarian adjacent leadership was what had saved France. Not parliament, not debate, not the messy, compromised, endlessly gridlocked machinery of democratic politics. One man with the will to impose hard choices on an ungrateful population had fixed what the politicians had broken. That lesson, that strong men solve problems that weak democracies cannot, was being drawn simultaneously across Europe. In Italy, Mussolini had drawn it in 1922. In Hungary, Miklos Horthy had drawn it. In Poland, Józef Pilsudski was about to draw it in 1926. The fact that France's version of this lesson was drawn from a relatively moderate conservative rather than an outright authoritarian does not change the shape of the lesson itself. The muscles were being trained. The habits of mind were being formed. I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it honestly. When you hear about ordinary reasonable people in the 1920s gradually drifting toward extreme politics, not because they were monsters, not because they had stopped caring about decency, but because they were frightened and angry and had been failed by the institutions that were supposed to protect them, does any part of that feel familiar? The fear of economic instability, the sense that the system is rigged for people who are not you, the exhaustion of watching everything you worked for slowly lose its value while someone else seems to float above it all on an ocean of good luck and good connections. That feeling is not unique to the 1920s. That feeling is one of the most persistent and dangerous forces in political life in any era. The question is always what it gets attached to. But there was one community in Paris during this decade that was paying very close attention to what was growing in the political shadows. Paying attention not as an intellectual exercise, not as a topic for salon debate, but as a matter of genuine personal survival. They were not French. Most of them were not American. Many of them had fled to Paris from places in Eastern and Central Europe, where the experiment with extreme nationalism had already produced consequences that were not theoretical at all. They were the artists and intellectuals of the surrealist movement, and the story of what they actually saw and what they were actually trying to say, and why the glamorous Paris they lived in largely refused to hear them, is one of the most haunting chapters in this entire story. That is where we're headed next. There is a particular kind of hypocrisy that only the most sophisticated societies seem capable of producing. Not the crude, obvious kind, where people simply say one thing and do another, and everyone quietly pretends not to notice. That kind of hypocrisy is almost universal and almost boring. No, I am talking about the elevated variety, the kind where an entire system of exploitation is dressed up in the language of public health civic order, and even, and this is the part that genuinely takes my breath away, the protection of women, where the paperwork is immaculate, where the inspectors make their rounds on schedule, where the whole machinery of state administration is brought to bear on the business of making sure that what is happening behind certain doors continues to happen in an orderly, regulated, taxable fashion. That is what France built in Paris over the course of the 19th century, and it was still very much operating in full official government-supervised capacity throughout the entire decade of the 1920s. The French system of licensed houses had its formal origins in a set of regulations developed under Napoleon Bonaparte in the early 1800s, refined and codified throughout the 19th century into what became known as the regulationist system, or, in French administrative language, the système de la tolérance. The word tolerance is doing considerable work in that phrase. What it meant in practice was this: the French state acknowledged that certain forms of commerce were going to exist, regardless of whether they were legal or illegal. Rather than drive them underground, where they would become impossible to monitor or control, the state would instead bring them into a formal regulatory framework. Licensed houses would be registered with the police prefecture. The women working inside them would be required to carry official registration cards and submit to regular medical inspections. The establishments themselves would be subject to periodic review. They would operate behind closed shutters with no visible signage on streets that were designated for this purpose by local authorities. In Paris, by the 1920s, there were officially around 200 such establishments operating under this framework. 200 in one city. Now, before we go any further, I want to acknowledge something honestly. The historical debate around the regulationist system is genuinely complex, and I do not think it serves anyone to flatten it into simple villainy. There were people in the 1920s, including some women's advocates and public health reformers, who argued in good faith that the regulationist system was genuinely preferable to the alternative, that it provided medical oversight, that it created a layer of visibility around a reality that would exist regardless, that without registration and inspection the spread of venereal disease would be even worse. These were not frivolous arguments. Syphilis and gonorrhea were significant public health crises in post-war France, and the medical profession of the era had only the most rudimentary tools for addressing them. The first effective treatment for syphilis, a compound called asphenamine marketed as salvarsan, had only been developed in 1910, and its use was still far from universal. So the medical argument for regulation was real, even if deeply imperfect. But here is what the medical argument conveniently left out. The registered women of Paris, the ones carrying those official cards from the prefecture, were not in any meaningful sense free participants in a regulated system designed for their protection. The registration card that was supposed to protect them also functioned in practice as one of the most effective mechanisms of control ever devised. Once a woman was registered, leaving the system was extraordinarily difficult. She could not simply walk away. Her registration had to be formally cancelled by the prefecture, a process that required documentation fees and the cooperation of bureaucrats who had very little institutional incentive to make the process easy. If she simply left without formal cancellation and was later found by the police, she could be forcibly returned and re-registered. This happened routinely. The system that presented itself as protecting women from exploitation was for a significant number of those women a trap that was considerably harder to exit than it had been to enter. The historian Alain Corbin, whose 1978 study Les Filles de Noces, translated into English as Women for Hire, remains the foundational academic work on this subject, documented in meticulous detail how the regulationist system functioned not as protection, but as what he called a form of enclosed and supervised servitude. Corbin's work drew on police records, medical inspection reports, and the accounts of social reformers who had been documenting conditions inside registered establishments since the mid-19th century. What he found was a system in which women had essentially no legal recourse, no ability to negotiate the terms of their situation, no access to the ordinary protections that French civil law theoretically offered every other citizen. They were for the purposes of the état civil, the civil registry, in a category of their own, simultaneously visible to the state and invisible to the law. Let me tell you about a woman whose story cuts through all the administrative language and lands somewhere much more human. Her name in the historical record appears simply as Marthe B. She is documented in the files of the Paris prefecture for the period between 1919 and 1928, one of the thousands of anonymous entries in the registration ledgers that Corbin and subsequent researchers have examined. What we know about Marthe B is this. She arrived in Paris from a small town in the Auvergne region of central France sometime in 1918 or early 1919. She was, by the prefecture's estimate, in her early 20s. She'd come looking for work as tens of thousands of young women from the French provinces did in this period, drawn by the Reconstruction boom and the sudden availability of employment in the city's factories and domestic service sector. Somewhere in the process of that migration, the records do not tell us exactly how, and that silence is itself significant, she ended up registered. The address listed on her registration card was an establishment on the Rue Saint-Denis, one of the longest established zones of this kind of commerce in Paris, a street that had carried this particular character since the Middle Ages. Marthe B appears in the prefecture records again in 1924, in connection with the request for cancellation of registration that was submitted on her behalf by a charitable organisation called the Œuvre de Préservation de la Jeune Fille. the Society for the Protection of Young Women, one of several Catholic and secular charitable organisations that had been working since the late 19th century to help women exit the system. The cancellation was eventually granted. It took 14 months from the initial request to the final paperwork, 14 months of navigating bureaucracy to undo a registration that, based on the timing of her arrival and her evident circumstances, she had almost certainly not entered with anything resembling full and informed consent. Martha then disappears from the historical record entirely. I find myself thinking about her more than most of the famous names in this story, because she is what the 1920s in Paris actually looked like for a very large number of people whose names never appeared in anyone's memoir. The geography of all this is worth understanding because it tells you something about how the city managed the coexistence of its official identity and its hidden one, the most celebrated establishments, the ones that appear in guidebooks aimed at wealthy foreign visitors, the ones that hosted politicians and industrialists and foreign dignitaries, were concentrated in the more prosperous arrondissements, the numbered administrative districts of Paris. The 2nd and 9th arrondissements in particular had establishments that were, by the standards of the era, almost ostentatiously well appointed. Red velvet, chandeliers, staff in formal dress. The whole presentation of luxury that made it possible for a certain kind of visitor to experience the whole transaction as sophisticated rather than simply what it was. The less celebrated establishments, the ones serving working-class clients, the ones on the Rue Saint-Denis and in the streets around the Gare du Nord, were considerably less glamorous and considerably more desperate in their atmosphere. The social reformer and writer Madeleine Pelletier, one of the first women to earn a medical degree in France, and a tireless and often infuriating campaigner for women's rights throughout the 1920s, visited and documented several of these establishments as part of her advocacy work. Her descriptions, published in feminist journals of the era, present a picture that is almost impossible to reconcile with the glittering mythology of the same city in the same decade. She described women who were in debt to the establishment for their room, their food, their clothing, a debt that was structured to ensure it could never quite be fully repaid, a technique that social scientists now recognize as debt bondage, regardless of whether that phrase was available in the vocabulary of 1920s Paris. One of the most revealing aspects of the whole system is who its most vocal defenders were. Medical authorities, as we have noted, defended it on public health grounds, but there was another category of defender whose arguments are considerably more revealing: the municipal and national politicians, who framed the licensed house system as essential to the maintenance of social order. The logic stated with remarkable frankness in several parliamentary debates during the 1920s was essentially this: that the existence of regulated establishments provided an outlet that reduced the risk of attacks on respectable women in public spaces. I want to let that logic sit in the room for a moment. The official argument made in the French Parliament by elected representatives in the 1920s was that the exploitation of a specific category of women was justified because it protected a different category of women, one group suffering as the designated price of another group's safety. It is one of the oldest and most persistent pieces of circular reasoning in the history of social policy, and it was being made with straight faces and formal suits, while the jazz bands played 2 streets away, and the art critics wrote ecstatic reviews of the latest surrealist exhibition. The licensed house system in France was finally abolished by a law passed in April of 1946 under the post-World War II government, pushed through by a deputy named Marthe Richard, who had herself been registered in an earlier period of her life and spent decades afterward advocating for abolition. The 1920s then represents a middle chapter in a story that took a very long time to reach even its partial resolution. And what strikes me most sitting with all of this history is not the existence of the system. Human societies have produced versions of this arrangement across cultures and centuries. What strikes me is the specific quality of the city's ability to hold it. Paris contained simultaneously Josephine Baker on a spotlight-bathed stage and Martha B in a prefecture ledger. It contained Gertrude Stein debating the nature of modernism and women in debt bondage 3 streets away. It contained Hemingway, writing about the price of oysters and the girls' Cafés walking past in their painted tin masks. The city held all of it, the beautiful and the brutal, the celebrated and the erased, and the music played through all of it. But here is what I've not yet told you about the 1920s in Paris, and it is perhaps the most uncomfortable piece of the entire puzzle. While the city was busy being glamorous, while the artists were being radical, and the politicians were being pragmatic, and the tourists were being enchanted, something was happening in the political atmosphere of France, and of Europe more broadly, that almost nobody in a Montparnasse café was paying close enough attention to. The economy of France was under severe and worsening strain. The franc was continuing to fall. The gap between those who had and those who did not was not narrowing. It was widening year by year with a kind of mechanical relentlessness. And into that gap something was growing. Something that had already taken root in Italy just across the border, something that the next chapter of our story is going to examine very closely. Because the party of the 1920s did not simply end because the money ran out. It ended because while everyone was dancing, nobody noticed what was being built in the shadows around the dance floor. And what was being built, it turns out, was something that would eventually cost the world far more than 10 million lives. Let me ask you something a little strange before we begin this part. Have you ever screamed at the top of your lungs in a room full of people and had every single one of them turn to each other and say, "Did you hear that?" How delightful! What wonderful self-expression! I wonder where we can buy a print of it. That is with only modest exaggeration what happened to the surrealists in 1920s Paris. They were not making art, or rather, they were making art, but that was not the point. The point was that they were trying with everything they had to hold up a mirror to a civilization they believed was sleepwalking toward catastrophe. To show the world the cracked, irrational, violent machinery that hummed beneath the surface of ordinary, respectable life. And Paris looked at the mirror, nodded appreciatively, and asked whether it came in a gold frame. To understand the surrealists, you need to go back slightly further than 1920. You need to go back to Zurich, Switzerland in 1916. While the Western Front was grinding through some of its most horrific months, the Battle of Verdun alone would eventually claim approximately 700,000 casualties on both sides. A small group of artists and poets gathered in a club called the Cabaret Voltaire on the Spiegelgasse and began doing something that by any conventional standard looked absolutely insane. They made noise. They read nonsense poetry, syllables chosen for sound rather than meaning chanted in overlapping voices until the words dissolved into pure rhythm. They performed pieces that had no discernible beginning, middle, or end. They made visual art by cutting up text and dropping the pieces at random and pasting whatever arrangement landed on the table. The movement called itself Dada, a word chosen by most accounts precisely because it meant nothing, or possibly because it meant everything. The founders disagreed on this, which was perhaps the point. The Romanian poet Tristan Tzara, one of Dada's central figures, described its purpose with a clarity that cuts right through the century between us. He said that Dada was not an art movement. It was a response to a world that had used the highest products of human civilization its science, its industry, its organizational genius, its rhetoric of progress and duty and national honor, to produce the most efficient machinery of mass death in human history. If this is what rationality produces, Zara was essentially saying, then let us try irrationality. If this is what meaning leads to, then let us try meaninglessness. It was not a joke, it was a diagnosis, and it was a deeply serious one. Dada migrated to Paris after the war, carried by Zara and others, and collided with a circle of young French writers and artists who had their own somewhat different set of obsessions. The collision produced surrealism, which was formally announced to the world in October of 1924, when a young poet and former medical student named André Breton published what he called the Manifeste du Surréalisme, the Surrealist Manifesto. Breton was by most accounts a genuinely difficult human being. He was brilliant, magnetic doctrinaire, and possessed of a certainty about his own rightness that his contemporaries found both inspiring and occasionally maddening. The writer Georges Bataille, who was in Breton's orbit for years before their spectacular falling out, once described him as the most impossible man I've ever known, and also the most necessary one. But the manifesto itself, whatever you make of its author, is a remarkable document. Breton defined surrealism as the exploration of the irrational, of dreams, of unconscious impulse, of the raw material of the mind, before it had been organized and censored and made presentable by the rational ego. He was drawing heavily on the work of Sigmund Freud, whose ideas about the unconscious mind had begun filtering into Parisian intellectual culture in the early 1920s. Breton had actually visited Freud in Vienna in 1921, hoping for a meeting of minds, and had come away somewhat disappointed. Freud was by all accounts distinctly unimpressed by his young French admirer's rather free interpretation of his theories. But the core insight that Breton took from Freud and ran with was this: that what people pretended to be, rational, controlled, civilized, and what they actually were, driven by desires and fears and irrationalities that they could barely acknowledge to themselves, were two very different things. And a civilization that refused to acknowledge that gap, that insisted on the fiction of its own rationality, even while behaving with profound irrationality, was a civilization that was structurally incapable of understanding itself. The painter Giorgio de Chirico, an Italian artist working in Paris whose influence on the surrealists was enormous, even though he is not always included under the surrealist label himself, had been producing his haunted, deserted cityscapes since before the war. His paintings from this period, empty piazzas with impossibly long shadows, classical statues standing in vast architectural spaces where no human being is present, a pervasive atmosphere of something having just happened or about to happen that the painting itself will never tell you about. When the surrealists discovered de Chirico's work, they recognized it immediately as depicting something they all felt but had not yet fully articulated. The feeling of living in a civilization whose official surfaces, the grand buildings, the formal spaces, the monuments to history and progress, had become completely disconnected from the actual human life supposedly occurring inside them. The monuments remained. The human beings had been processed through the trenches and come out the other side as something the monuments did not have a category for. Man Ray arrived in Paris from New York in July of 1921, carrying almost no money and a letter of introduction from Marcel Duchamp to the Dadaist community. Within a few years, he had reinvented photography as a medium for surrealist investigation. His rayographs, made by placing objects directly on photosensitive paper and exposing them to light without a camera, produced images that looked like X-rays of dreams. He photographed the extraordinary Kiki of Montparnasse. Her real name was Alice Prynne, and she was one of the great characters of the entire era, a model and singer and artist in her own right, whose memoir of this period remains one of the most vivid accounts available, in images that were simultaneously intimate and deeply strange. Man Ray also made one of the most quietly devastating objects of the entire decade a flat iron with a row of sharp metal tacks glued to its pressing surface titled cadeau, meaning gift. It was made in 1921, produced in an edition of one for an exhibition opening, and what it did was take an utterly familiar domestic object, the thing you use to make clothes smooth and presentable, and make it suddenly viscerally dangerous. Every time I think about that iron, I think about all the ways that the 1920s in Paris did exactly the same thing. Presented something smooth and gleaming and domesticated on the surface, while the thing that had cut you was right there if you were paying attention. Salvador Dali arrived on the Paris scene relatively late. He made his first significant appearance in the city in 1929 just as the decade was drawing to its close, so in a strict chronological sense his contribution belongs slightly outside our central window. But his 1929 collaboration with the filmmaker Luis Buñuel on the short film Un Chien Andalou, which premiered in Paris in June of that year, is too significant to pass over. The film opens with a scene of deliberate methodical violence against an eye. Breton called it the most important surrealist work yet produced. Audiences either walked out or sat in stunned silence. Several critics wrote about it with a mixture of outrage and unmistakable excitement that tells you exactly how effectively it had landed. What Dali and Buñuel were doing was not trying to shock for the sake of shock, or not only that. They were making visible the violence that polite society required you to look away from. They were saying you've been trained to not see certain things. We're going to make it impossible for you to not see them even for 90 seconds. The audience's discomfort was the work. And yet, here is the part that I find genuinely heartbreaking, and that I think is the most important thing to understand about the surrealist place in the 1920s story. Paris consumed them, enthusiastically, expensively, fashionably consumed them, while almost entirely missing the point. The first surrealist exhibition held at the Galerie Pierre in Paris in November of 1925 was a social event. The right people attended, the right critics reviewed it, the works were discussed, debated, celebrated, and then the same people went to dinner at Maxime's. By the late 1920s, surrealism had become, and Breton was furious about this, which is at least partly why he spent so much of his energy expelling people from the movement in fits of doctrinal purity, a style, an aesthetic, something you could reference in a perfume advertisement, something you could incorporate into a window display at a department store on the Boulevard Haussmann. The screen had been decorated and made into wallpaper. The poet Paul Eluard, one of the surrealist circle's most gifted writers, spent much of the 1920s writing love poetry of extraordinary beauty, and simultaneously becoming increasingly politically engaged, eventually joining the French Communist Party, and spending the 1930s as one of the most committed anti-fascist voices in French literature. Louis Aragon, another central figure in the surrealist orbit, followed a similar trajectory, from experimental poetry to committed political writing, eventually breaking with Breton over the question of how artists should relate to political movements. These were not people who simply made decorative objects and moved on. They were genuinely trying to figure out what the role of the artist was in a society they believed was in the process of destroying itself. The tragedy is not that they failed to be heard at all. The tragedy is that the part of their work that got heard was the aesthetic surface, while the diagnostic content, the part that was saying something is deeply wrong with this civilization, and we can show you the X-ray, that part got filed under interesting and left there. In December of 1924, a young man named Benjamin Perret, a committed surrealist poet and one of Breton's closest collaborators, published a short piece in the surrealist journal La Révolution surréaliste, in which he described a recurring dream. In the dream, Paris was completely empty. All the people had gone. The buildings remained, the streets remained, the shop windows remained. All the physical apparatus of the most glamorous city in the world sitting perfectly intact and entirely abandoned. He woke up, he wrote, with the sensation not of loss, but of relief. A city without its performance, without its requirement that you participate in the pretending, just the stones and the light. When I read that, I think about all the people in this story who never got to feel that relief. The veterans with their trembling hands, Martha B. in her prefecture ledger, the women in their painted masks of borrowed identity, the bakers watching the price of flour climb beyond reach. The surrealists were screaming in their oblique, brilliant, difficult way on behalf of all of them. The city heard the sound and called it art. Which brings us finally to the piece of this puzzle that ties everything together. Because all of the things we've been talking about, the economic anxiety, the political radicalization, the creative community's growing sense that something was very wrong, the shadow economies operating beneath the gleaming surface, all of them were converging toward a single point on the calendar, a date in October, a number on a stock ticker, and the very specific, very human stories of what happened to the people in this story. Josephine Baker Kiki of Montparnasse, the veterans in their associations, the American writers in their Montparnasse cafés, when the music finally definitively stopped. That is where we are going next. October the 24th, 1929. In Paris it was a Thursday. A perfectly ordinary Thursday in a city that had been hosting perfectly extraordinary evenings for nearly a decade. The cafés on the boulevard de Montparnasse were full. The jazz at Bricktops was good. Somewhere in the 6th arrondissement, someone was opening a bottle of something decent and not thinking particularly hard about anything. Across the Atlantic Ocean in New York City, the New York Stock Exchange had just opened for the day. By the time it closed, nearly 13 million shares had been traded in a single session, a volume so far beyond anything the market's infrastructure had been designed to handle that the ticker tape machines fell hours behind reality printing prices that were already ancient history by the time the paper hit the floor. The number that mattered, though, the one that would echo forward through the next decade like a bell that could not be unrung, was not 13 million. It was 25 billion. $25 billion of market value evaporated in a single day. And that was just the beginning. Most people, when they think about the Wall Street crash, picture it as an American story, which is understandable. It happened in America. It was American banks, American investors, American financial institutions that were most visibly and immediately destroyed. But here is what tends to get left out of the standard account. Paris felt it within weeks, not months, weeks. The connection was financial, but it was also human, and the human connection is the one I want to trace with you tonight because it is considerably more intimate and considerably more devastating than any economic statistic. The first thing that happened to Paris after the crash was a departure. The Americans left. Not all at once, not on a single boat, not in a dramatic scene of panicked crowds at the Gare Saint-Lazare, but steadily, persistently, with a quiet urgency that anyone who knew the city well could feel. Almost immediately, the community that had been sustaining enormous portions of Parisian cultural and commercial life for nearly a decade began to dissolve. The mathematics of it were simple and brutal. The American writers and artists and tourists who'd been living so magnificently in Paris on the favourable exchange rate were living on American money, American investments, American trust funds, American family allowances, American newspaper contracts that had been signed when editors in New York were feeling generous. All of those income streams had just been connected to a machine that was now running in reverse. A young American painter who had been living comfortably in Montparnasse on $200 a month discovered that his monthly transfer from his family in Connecticut had stopped arriving because his father's brokerage account had been essentially eliminated in 3 days of trading. A writer who had been surviving on freelance pieces for American magazines found that the magazines were suddenly cutting their foreign correspondent budgets with a speed and ruthlessness that made the earlier generosity look like a dream. A couple who had been sustaining a pleasant life in the 7th arrondissement on the dividends from a portfolio of railway stocks found that the dividends had stopped. The portfolio had been margined, and the broker's letter waiting for them at the American Express office on the Rue Scribe was not good news. By the end of 1929, the American community in Paris had begun noticeably shrinking. By 1931, it was a fraction of what it had been. By 1933, the extraordinary, improbable, genuinely unrepeatable world of the American expatriate in 1920s, Paris was for all practical purposes over. The Café du Dôme on the boulevard de Montparnasse had been at its peak in the mid-1920s, so reliably populated with American and British writers and artists that a Paris-based correspondent for an American newspaper had once described it as the spiritual embassy of the English-speaking world. Every afternoon and most evenings the terrace was occupied by a rotating cast of people who were either famous about to be famous or desperately convinced they were about to be famous. By 1931 the terrace was quieter. By 1932 the proprietor had reduced his staff. The change was not catastrophic overnight. Paris is resilient and the dome is still there today, which is one of those facts about the city that never fails to move me a little. But the specific atmosphere, the specific gathering, the specific electricity of that particular community in that particular moment, that was gone. And everyone who had been part of it knew it was gone even if they could not quite say precisely when it had ended. Hemingway had actually left Paris for good in 1928, a year before the crash. His marriage to Hadley Richardson had ended. He had remarried, his literary fortunes had shifted, and the city that had shaped his writing had become in some complicated emotional way a place he needed distance from. But his great Paris memoir, A Movable Feast, which I mentioned early in our story, he wrote not in Paris but in Cuba and Idaho, decades after the fact, looking back at a city that existed more completely in memory than in any geography he could return to. The book was published in 1964, 3 years after his death. And what strikes me every time I read it is the quality of the longing in it. Not nostalgia exactly. Hemingway was too honest and too proud for simple nostalgia. Something more complicated. The feeling of a man describing the last place where he'd been purely himself before fame and consequence and the accumulating weight of his own legend made simplicity impossible. If you are lucky enough to have lived in Paris as a young man, he wrote then, wherever you go for the rest of your life, it stays with you, for Paris is a movable feast. He wrote those words about the 1920s. He wrote them knowing exactly what had come after. Fitzgerald's trajectory after the crash is harder to look at directly, and I say that with genuine feeling rather than dramatization. Francis Scott Key. Fitzgerald had published The Great Gatsby in 1925, a novel that is among its many other qualities the most precise and beautiful X-ray of the relationship between money desire and self-destruction that American literature has produced. His Gatsby throwing his parties in the hope that one of the guests will turn out to be the thing he cannot live without is perhaps the defining image of the entire era. By 1930, Fitzgerald's wife Zelda had suffered a severe mental breakdown and been admitted to a psychiatric clinic in Switzerland. Fitzgerald was spending money faster than he could earn it, writing short stories for popular magazines to cover the medical bills, unable to concentrate on the novel that would eventually painfully become Tender is the Night. He was not in Paris during the worst years, but the Paris he had known, the Paris of the mid-1920s of evenings at the Ritz and weekends on the Riviera, and the magnificent, wasteful, glittering life that he had both celebrated and diagnosed. That Paris had preceded him into collapse. The rich he wrote in his extraordinary 1936 autobiographical essay The Crack-Up are different from you and me. And then in the same essay, in the same breath, almost he wrote about what it felt like when the money was gone and the certainty was gone, and what you had left was yourself, which turned out to be considerably less impressive than advertised. He died in Hollywood in December of 1940 at 44 years old, working on a novel about the film industry, and largely forgotten by the literary establishment that had once celebrated him so extravagantly. The Paris he had loved was already a different city before he was gone. The story of Kiki of Montparnasse after the crash is one that genuinely breaks my heart a little, and I do not say that lightly. Alice Prynne, Kiki, had been at the absolute centre of the Montparnasse world throughout the 20s. She had modelled for Man Ray, for Fujita, for dozens of the significant painters of the era. She'd performed her own cabaret act at the Jockey Club on the Rue du Montparnasse, a tiny venue that managed to feel like the most important room in the world when she was on its stage. Her memoir published in 1929 with a preface by Hemingway himself, who wrote that she had been a woman who was never dull and never had an unkind word for anybody, sold well enough to suggest she had a future as a writer. The 1930s were not kind to her. The community that had sustained her, the foreign artists, the wealthy patrons, the particular ecosystem of creative poverty and creative wealth that Montparnasse had represented, had scattered. The money had dried up. The patrons had gone home or gone broke or both. She struggled with her health. She performed when she could find engagements. She opened a small café that did not flourish. She died in 1953, largely forgotten outside the circles of art historians. She was 52 years old. Her memoir, which is one of the most vivid and funny and alive documents of the entire era, went out of print and stayed there for decades. The Depression hit France slightly later than it hit the United States, and slightly differently. France's economy was less dependent on speculative finance and more grounded in agriculture and small industry, which provided a measure of buffer. The worst French unemployment figures did not arrive until 1932 and 1933. But when they arrived, they landed on a population that was already exhausted, already politically polarized, already carrying the unhealed weight of the war and the unresolved bitterness of the franc crisis, and the unacknowledged grief of a generation that had never been given permission to grieve. By 1934, France was experiencing genuine political violence. In February of that year, right-wing leagues, including some of the organizations we discussed when we talked about the political shadows gathering during the 20s, converged on the Place de la Concorde in Paris and clashed with police in riots that left 15 people dead and several hundred injured. 15 dead. On the Place de la Concorde, the most beautiful square in the most beautiful city in the world, the party had not just ended. The venue itself had become a battlefield. Let me ask you something, and I want you to think about this carefully. If you had been standing on the terrace of the Café du Dôme in the summer of 1926, the peak of everything, the champagne flowing, the jazz audible from 2 streets away, the city glittering in the late evening light, would you have seen it coming? Would you have looked around at all that beauty and abundance and creativity and energy and thought, in 3 years this will be over? In 5 years, the people sitting at these tables will be scattered across the world. In 8 years there will be blood on the Place de la Concorde. I think, if I am honest with myself, the answer is probably no. Because that is not how it feels when you are inside it. When you are inside it, it feels permanent. It feels like the natural state of things. It feels with all the conviction that the present moment always carries, like, this is simply how life is. And that maybe is the most important thing to understand about what came next. Not the economics, not even the politics, but the particular human quality of being unable to see the end of something you are standing in the middle of. Because there is one final piece of this story that ties everything together, and it is the one that I think matters most for us tonight in our own particular moment. It is the question of the myth itself. Why, after everything we have talked about over the course of this story, the shell shock and the franc crisis and the exploitation and the political shadows gathering and the crash and the scattering, why do we still dream about Paris in the 1920s the way we do? Why does the mythology persist, not just intact but burnished and glowing, despite everything history tells us was actually happening beneath the surface? That question has an answer, and the answer turns out to tell us something surprisingly important about ourselves. That is where we are headed right now. There is a film that came out in 2011 that I think about every single time I sit down to research this era. Woody Allen's Midnight in Paris. If you have not seen it, and no pressure, this is not a homework assignment. The premise is this. A contemporary American writer on vacation in Paris discovers that at the stroke of midnight, a vintage car appears and whisks him back to the 1920s, where he spends his evenings drinking with Hemingway and Fitzgerald and Gertrude Stein and Picasso and Dali, all of whom are charming and brilliant and exactly as advertised. The film is warm, it is witty, it is beautifully shot. It made over $150 million worldwide on a $17 million budget, which in cinema terms means it touched something very deep and very real in a very large number of people. And watching it, I felt two things simultaneously. The first was genuine pleasure, because the fantasy it offers is a lovely one, and I am not immune to lovely things. The second was a quiet, persistent unease, because the Paris in that film, the Paris of the midnight car and the charming geniuses and the golden light and the effortless wit, is a Paris that was constructed almost entirely from mythology. From the carefully curated, posthumously edited, beautifully lit version of a decade that, as we have now spent many hours examining together, was considerably more complicated, considerably more painful, and considerably more human than any midnight car ride can accommodate. And the question I want to spend this chapter sitting with is, why do we need that myth so badly? Because we clearly do. The box office numbers prove it. The psychological mechanism at work here has a name, and it is one that the Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman spent much of his career examining. He called it, among other things, the remembering self versus the experiencing self. Kahneman's research demonstrated something that most of us probably sense intuitively, but rarely examine directly, that the way we remember experiences and the way we actually live through them are two fundamentally different things. The remembering self edits, it compresses, it tends to retain the peak moments and the final moments of any experience and discard much of what fell between them, including the tedium, the anxiety, the physical discomfort, the genuine darkness. Apply that mechanism to an entire decade filtered through a century of literary celebration and cinematic romanticization and tourism marketing and cultural myth-making, and what you get is something that resembles the 1920s in Paris, the way a perfume advertisement resembles actual human life. The highlights remain, the shadows have been removed in post-production. But here is what I find genuinely fascinating about this particular myth, and what I think makes it worth examining more carefully than most. The 1920s mythology did not assemble itself accidentally. It was constructed largely and quite deliberately by the very people who had lived through the decade, and they constructed it under specific circumstances for specific emotional and psychological reasons that have everything to do with what came after. Think about when most of the great memoirs and retrospective accounts of 1920s Paris were written. Hemingway began working on A Movable Feast in the late 1950s. He was writing it in the shadow of 2 world wars, a failed marriage, the Cuban Revolution, his own declining health, and the accumulated weight of a life that had contained rather more experience than most human nervous systems are designed to handle. Bricktop published her memoir in 1983. She was writing as a very old woman looking back across 60 years at a time when she'd been young, and the world had seemed for one improbable decade genuinely full of possibility. The painter Kiki's memoir, which we discussed earlier, was written in 1929, at the very moment the world it described was ending. She was writing about a present that was already becoming a past in real time, with the particular desperate clarity of someone who can feel something slipping away and cannot stop it. In every case, the memoir was written from a position of loss, from a position of knowing what had come after, from the perspective of people who had lived through the Depression, through the rise of fascism, through World War II, through the specific and irreversible education of seeing the 20th century in its full brutality. Viewed from that vantage point, the 1920s in Paris did not look like a decade with a complicated dark side. It looked like paradise. It looked like the last moment before everything broke. It looked like innocence, even if, as we've seen it, was never actually innocent at all. The philosopher and cultural critic Walter Benjamin, a German Jewish intellectual who spent significant time in Paris in the 1920s and 30s, and whose writing on the city is among the most profound ever produced, described what he called the wish images that modern culture generates around its lost golden ages. These wish images, Benjamin argued, are not simply nostalgia in the ordinary sense. They are something more active and more revealing. They tell us less about the past they claim to depict than about the present from which they are generated. When a society produces an intense, commercially successful, culturally pervasive mythology around a specific moment in history, the question worth asking is not what was that moment really like. The question is, what is this society missing right now that it is trying to find in that mythology? What does the myth of 1920s Paris offer that the people consuming it in 2011 or 2024 or whenever you are watching this feel is absent from their own lives? I think the honest answer involves several things. A sense of community around creative work in an era of increasing isolation. A sense that art and ideas matter in an era of increasing commodification of everything. A sense of physical embodied presence in the world. The wine, the cafes, the slow evenings, the conversations that lasted until the light changed, in an era of increasing mediation of experience through screens. A sense that the future was open, that things could be different, that the rules were up for renegotiation, in an era that often feels like the rules have been permanently set by forces too large and too remote to negotiate with. These are real hungers, and they deserve real acknowledgement. The problem is not that we feel them. The problem is what happens when we try to satisfy them with a myth, instead of examining their actual sources. Here is where I want to get genuinely honest with you, because this is the part that I think matters most. The romanticization of 1920s. Paris is not merely a harmless aesthetic preference. It is not just a matter of some people liking old movies and jazz and the idea of sitting in a cafe with a typewriter. It has a cost. And the cost is this: when we remember the 1920s as primarily a story of beautiful creativity and personal liberation, we make it harder to see the full picture. We make it harder to learn the lessons that the full picture contains. And those lessons, about what happens when a traumatized society chooses glamour over grief, about what grows in the political shadows when the middle class is squeezed and frightened and given no constructive outlet for its anxiety about the human cost of systems of exploitation that the powerful find convenient to look away from. Those lessons are not academic. They are not safely historical. They are alive. The historian Robert Paxton, whose work on the French response to fascism in the 1930s and 40s remains essential, Reading made a point in an interview late in his career that has stayed with me ever since. He said roughly that the most dangerous aspect of studying fascism's rise in Europe is not the difficulty of understanding how it happened. The mechanism, he said, is actually not mysterious once you look at it clearly. What is dangerous is the human tendency to believe that the people among whom it happened were fundamentally different from us. Less educated, less sophisticated, less morally aware, living in a different world with different rules. The people of 1920s Paris were not fundamentally different from us. They were brilliant and creative and funny and politically engaged and genuinely trying to understand their world. They also had an enormous collective capacity for looking away from things that were uncomfortable to look at directly. And so do we. That is not a condemnation. It is a description. The capacity to look away from uncomfortable things is not a character flaw. It is a survival mechanism. It is what allows people to eat breakfast and get through the day and love their families and create beautiful things in the face of a world that contains always more darkness than any individual consciousness can fully absorb. The problem is not the looking away. The problem is when the looking away becomes systematic, when it becomes cultural policy, when the myth-making machinery of a civilization is put to work ensuring that certain things remain consistently, reliably, attractively invisible. Woody Allen made a film about Paris in the 1920s, and it was charming and people loved it, and I understand completely why. But there is another film about Paris in the same era that far fewer people have seen, made by the French director Bertrand Tavernier in 1974, and titled Que la fête commence, Let Joy Reign Supreme. It is set slightly earlier than the 1920s in the Regency period of the early 18th century, but it uses that historical setting to talk with startling directness about what it actually looks like when a ruling class devotes itself to pleasure and spectacle, while the people beneath them move toward genuine desperation. In Tavernier's film, the parties are still beautiful, the music is still extraordinary, the costumes are magnificent, and outside the palace windows people are dying. Both films are about Paris. Both are about the specific seduction that this city offers. But only one of them asks you to look at what you might be choosing not to see. I want to end this chapter with something that I think captures the whole paradox better than I can say it in plain language. In 1931, 2 years after the crash, with the Depression deepening and the political atmosphere in France darkening considerably, a Parisian photographer named André Kertész walked through the streets of Montparnasse on a quiet afternoon and took a series of photographs that are now among the most celebrated images of the era. They show an empty cafe terrace, a few chairs, a table with an unfinished glass on it, the particular quality of afternoon light on a Parisian pavement. No people. The beauty is undeniable. The loneliness is undeniable. And the two things are so completely inseparable in these photographs that you cannot look at them without feeling both at once. That is, I think, the most honest image of what Les Années Folles actually was. The beautiful chairs, the empty table, the glass that someone left behind. And now we have arrived at the final piece of our story tonight, not the history of what happened. We have covered that as honestly and completely as I know how to. But the question that has been underneath everything we have said from the very first moment, from the image of Paris sitting on 10 million graves and deciding to dance anyway, what do we do with all of this? What do we do with the knowledge that beauty and darkness are not opposites, that they have always lived in the same city at the same address, sometimes in the same room? What does it mean to love a myth without being trapped inside it? And what would it look like, genuinely, practically, humanly, to remember the full story, not the midnight car, not the champagne and the jazz and the golden light, the whole thing, all of it, the masks and the music together? That is the final question. And I think the answer might be more important than anything else I've said tonight. Let us find it together. So here we are, at the end of the party, or rather, at the place where the party finally becomes honest enough to tell us what it was actually about. We have walked through a lot of darkness together tonight. Shell shock and debt bondage and cocaine on cafe tables and fascists gathering in the shadows while the jazz played. We have met men who came home from the trenches and never quite arrived. We have stood in the prefecture of police ledgers with Martha B, and on the stage of the Folies Bergère with Josephine Baker, and on the empty terrace of the Dome with Kiki's unfinished glass. And now I want to ask you the question that all of this has been building toward. Not as a rhetorical flourish, not as a dramatic closing statement, as a genuine question from someone who's spent a long time sitting with this history and found it uncomfortably persistently relevant. What do we actually owe the full story of the past? In 2002, the city of Paris officially renamed a street in the 18th arrondissement, a small street that had previously carried an unremarkable bureaucratic name, after Sidney Bechet. The New Orleans soprano saxophonist who'd been celebrated in Paris, imprisoned in Paris, and eventually deported from Paris, who had spent a year in a French cell while the city that claimed to love him processed him through a legal system that in that particular moment did not love him quite enough to treat him fairly. The renaming was a gesture, a modest one, a street sign in a city of thousands of street signs. But I find myself genuinely moved by it. Not because a street sign fixes anything. It does not bring back the year he spent incarcerated or undo the specific injustice of his deportation, or adequately compensate for the ways that Paris's love for Black American music consistently fell short of its love for Black American musicians as full human beings. What it does is refuse the erasure. It says this happened here. This specific person with this specific history in this specific city. Not only the triumphant parts, the complicated parts too. That refusal of erasure is, I think, the most important thing any society can do with its own history, and it is considerably harder than it sounds. The French government did not formally acknowledge the role of French institutions in the exploitation of women under the regulationist system until the 20th century was well advanced. The scholarly work of Alain Corbin and others published from the 1970s onward forced a reckoning with what the administrative records had always contained, if anyone had been willing to read them honestly. The girls' Cafés, the broken-faced veterans of the First World War, were not adequately compensated or cared for by the French state during their lifetimes. The veterans' organisations fought for decades for basic pension rights, for medical coverage, for the acknowledgement that what had happened to them in the trenches was not a private misfortune but a public responsibility. Many of them did not live to see that acknowledgement fully made. The shell-shocked veterans, the ones whose wounds were invisible, whose suffering the medical establishment of the 1920s was not yet equipped to name or treat, were largely left to manage their trauma alone with wine and silence, and the company of other men who understood without needing to be told. The word trauma in its modern psychological sense, as a clinical description of a specific kind of nervous system injury with identifiable symptoms and evidence-based treatments, did not enter mainstream medical usage until decades later. They had the experience. They did not have the language, and without the language they could not even fully ask for what they needed. Here is the part of this story that I think about most often. Not the famous names, not Hemingway or Fitzgerald or Baker or Cocteau, the ordinary people, the young woman from the Auvergne who ended up in a prefecture ledger and then disappeared from the historical record entirely, the veteran from Normandy who came home to a changed world and spent his evenings in a bar on the Rue de Belleville with other men who did not need to explain themselves, the Parisian baker who watched the price of flour climb and the value of his savings fall, and felt the floor dropping away, and did not have any adequate framework for understanding why. These people do not have films made about them. They do not have streets named after them. They do not have Woody Allen going back in time to have drinks with them. But they were Paris. More than any of the famous names, they were the actual texture of the city, the actual weight of the decade, and the measure of how honestly we engage with this history is, I think, largely a measure of whether we can hold those invisible lives alongside the visible ones, whether we can look at the beautiful myth and say yes and also. Yes and also. There is a concept in moral philosophy that the ethicist Margaret Urban Walker has written about under the name of moral repair, the work that societies and individuals must do when they've been damaged by injustice or violence or systemic failure in order to restore something that functions like trust and shared life. Walker argues, and I find this genuinely convincing, that moral repair is not primarily about punishment or retribution. It is about acknowledgement, about the specific act of saying clearly and without deflection this happened. These people were harmed. The harm was real. We're not going to look away from it. That acknowledgement does not undo the harm. Nothing undoes the harm, but it changes the relationship between the living and the past in a way that matters enormously for what the living choose to do next. A society that has honestly reckoned with how its golden age was built, who paid for it, who was excluded from it, whose suffering was the condition of its glamour, is a different society from one that has not. It makes different choices. It notices different warning signs. It is in a very practical sense harder to fool. When I first started researching this story, really going deep into it beyond the surface mythology, into the police records and the medical reports and the memoirs that nobody reads anymore and the scholarly histories that never made it onto any bestseller list, I went through a period of feeling quite sad about it. Sad in the specific way that you feel sad when something you love turns out to be more complicated than you wanted it to be. I had loved the mythology. I had loved the idea of Hemingway and his cheap oysters and his movable feast. I had loved the image of Paris as the place where art and freedom and human possibility had converged for one extraordinary, unrepeatable decade. And discovering the darkness underneath that, not as a theoretical abstraction, but in the specific documented human detail of actual people's actual lives, that was genuinely disorienting. But here is what I found on the other side of that disorientation, and it is the thing I most want to leave with you tonight. The full story is better. Not more comfortable, not more reassuring, not easier to turn into a charming film with a good soundtrack. Better, more true, more human, more worthy of the people it is about. A Josephine Baker who was a strategic, clear-eyed, extraordinarily intelligent woman navigating a system designed to see her as a symbol rather than a person, and doing it with grace and humour and courage, is more remarkable than a Josephine Baker who simply arrived in Paris and was universally adored. A veteran who danced until 4 a.m. because he understood in his bones that time is not guaranteed, carrying his invisible wounds and his radical aliveness simultaneously, is more genuinely heroic than a veteran in a simplified story of either triumph or tragedy. An artist who screamed into the indifferent surface of a glamorous city and kept screaming anyway, even knowing the city might never hear the actual content of the scream. That is a story of human stubbornness and commitment that I find more moving than any myth of effortless genius. The full story gives us back the full people, and the full people, it turns out, were extraordinary. So what do we do with all of this practically right now, tonight? I think the answer is simpler than we tend to make it. We practice the habit of the and also. When we encounter a beautiful story, about a golden era, about a remarkable city, about a decade that seems to glow with creative energy and human possibility, we let ourselves enjoy it fully. We do not have to be suspicious of beauty, and also we ask who is not in this picture. What did it cost? Who paid? What was being built in the shadows while everyone was admiring the light? Not as a political exercise, not as a performance of critical awareness, as a genuine act of curiosity, as a way of honouring the full complexity of the human beings whose lives we are inheriting as history. Josephine Baker became a French citizen in 1937. She worked for the French intelligence services during the Second World War with a courage that no amount of glamorous mythology can actually overstate. She really did carry coded messages hidden in her sheet music across borders, really did risk her life, really did use her access and her celebrity in the service of something that mattered enormously. In 2021, 94 years after she arrived in France from St. Louis, Missouri, Josephine Baker was inducted into the Pantheon, France's monument to its greatest citizens. She became the first black woman, the first American-born person, and the 6th woman in the history of the institution to receive that honour. The ceremony was attended by the French president. There were speeches, there was music. There was the kind of collective acknowledgement that nations produce when they are trying, however belatedly, to do something right. It was 94 years late, and it happened. Both things are true. At the same time, the Café du Dôme is still there on the boulevard de Montparnasse. The terrace still gets afternoon light in a particular way that feels, even if you have never been there before, somehow familiar, because you have seen it in photographs, in films, in 100 reimaginings of a moment that existed and ended and left its ghost everywhere. If you go and sit there and order something and watch the street, you're sitting in the same physical space where all of this happened, where the veterans drank their wine in companionable silence, where the Americans spent their improbable dollars, where Kiki walked past on her way to whatever the evening held. The stones remember everything. The question is whether we are willing to listen to all of it. Tonight you have listened to all of it, or as much of it as we could fit into one journey together. You have sat with the darkness and the glamour simultaneously. You have let the full picture be complicated. You have, I hope, come away with something more than the golden myth, and something more useful than simple disillusionment. Because the point was never to take something beautiful away from you. The point was to give you something more beautiful in its place. The real Paris, the real 1920s, the real people, brilliant and broken and funny and frightened and extraordinarily stubbornly defiantly alive, the masks and the music together, all of it real, all of it worth remembering. If this story moved you at all, if any moment in this journey tonight made you think differently about something, or feel something you were not expecting to feel, I would genuinely love to know which part. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and conversations that start in the comments section of this channel are consistently some of the most thoughtful I have anywhere. And if you have been with me this whole journey and you have not yet subscribed, well, you have now spent the better part of 2.5 hours in my company, which I think makes us friends. Friends subscribe. That is just the rule. I did not make it up, but I am choosing to enforce it warmly and without pressure. Thank you for being here. Genuinely. The fact that you show up at this hour ready to sit with real history and real complexity, ready to let a story be what it actually is, rather than what would be easier, that means something to me that I find genuinely difficult to put into words. Rest well tonight. And when you wake up, remember, every era looks golden in hindsight. The job is to see your own era clearly while you're still inside it. The next story we tell together is going to take us somewhere equally unexpected, equally complicated, equally full of the beautiful and the difficult living side by side in the same room. I think you are going to love it. Stay close.